The title I was given is Refugee, Crises, Challenging European Values. And what I want to suggest this afternoon is that the refugee emergency that faces both the European Union and the wider Europe is symptomatic of a wider identity crisis. What are the specifically European values? Do Europeans actually hold them in common? And what is Europe for? What is its purpose? And does it live up to that purpose? And in what follows, I will suggest that the wider refugee crisis is the most serious of all of the crises that are currently engulfing the European continent. The way in which the various countries are dealing with the migrants, I think, does cast a dark shadow over the triple promise that was made after the Second World War, and a promise that essentially gave rise to the European process of integration. And that triple promise is peace, prosperity, and partnership. And I think that triple promise is now at greater threat than ever before since 1945. The other argument I will want to make is that the current crises, especially the refugee emergency, also raise fundamental questions about Europe's foundational values. And they are, again, three values that I want to highlight: solidarity, subsidiarity, and unity in diversity. You might say that they apply mostly to the European Union, but I think we can also say that they do apply to the wider Europe insofar as the European Union tries to associate neighboring countries to its project. The neighborhood policy, the Eastern Partnership, and so on and so forth. Let me start then with the refugee crisis. After an era of transition from communism and totalitarianism to capitalism and democracy, Europe is now living in an age of perma-crisis. The continent is confronting 7 simultaneous crises, perhaps more, but I just want to highlight quickly those 7. First, the migration crisis. Second, the threat of terrorism. Third, the ongoing turmoil in the Eurozone. Fourth, China's economic slowdown and other structural problems in the world economy. Fifth, corporate scandals in finance, in banking, and in industry, as well as tax evasion highlighted by the Panama Papers. Sixth, the continual war and instability in Ukraine. And seventh, all the new geopolitical tensions, whether between Russia and Turkey, or indeed along Europe's southern border in North Africa, and indeed its southeastern border on the Balkans and in the Middle East. Of these 7 crises, the migrant emergency is undoubtedly the most serious one. Above all, it is a humanitarian catastrophe of perhaps unprecedented scope and intensity for some time now. It's already claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. A major source of this crisis is, of course, the civil war in Syria, which for many years now has been fueled by the intervention of outside powers. The US, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and France on the one hand, and Russia, Iran, and Shia forces such as Hezbollah on the other hand, but also, of course, the prominent role played by the Kurds and other regional groups in that conflict. I think it's also true that the military intervention of both Western countries and Russia has exacerbated this situation. There's very little doubt that aerial bombing has a huge impact on civilian populations. And at the same time, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the advance of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is something that needed to be confronted, and does need to be confronted still today. Quite simply because it's led to the brutal killing of tens of thousands of people, especially Shia Muslims, but also Christians and the Yazidi. So arguably, trying to stop ISIS and other Islamist groups is not so much a clash of civilizations, as some people have said, between the West and Islam. Rather, it's a battle against barbarism and for civilization. It's a battle for ancient ways of life, for the ancestral homeland, for millennia-old traditions and the coexistence of different faith communities. So yes, the crisis of migration is fueled by the civil war and by military intervention, but I don't think we can therefore conclude that military intervention is the only problem that needs to stop. What really needs to stop is the sectarian conflict. And that is a conflict, as I said, that's not a clash of civilizations, it's much more a battle for civilization and against barbarism. Europe's response to the events in Syria and Iraq also, I think, pose a particular challenge to European values, the basic freedoms of both citizens and migrants. The political and the public debate on the migration crisis, I think, very often lacks basic, reliable facts. So let me just try and put three forward for discussion. The first fact, I think, is that the flow of refugees doesn't just come from the Middle East, but also from parts of Africa and indeed the wider European space, all the way from the Russian border via Turkey and the Balkans to Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia. So in other words, yes, the Middle East is perhaps one of the main sources, but we shouldn't forget other migration flows that are all ending up at the moment in Europe. Second, human trafficking is a major driving force of migration. It's vast and it's growing. It's estimated that there are between 40,000 traffickers at work, with a business, in inverted commas, worth anything between $3 and $6 billion. So clearly, if we want to deal with migration, we need to deal with human trafficking. And as was already said yesterday, whilst slavery in the old sense is perhaps disappeared in many ways across the world and in Europe as well, new forms of slavery are on the rise. If by slavery, or by new slavery, we mean, for instance, forced labor. And that is something which, again, is linked to trafficking, it's linked to the sex trade and so on, and it needs to be confronted. The third fact is that I think migration encompasses a wide range of different cases. We have refugees fleeing civil war like in Syria. We have asylum seekers who suffer different forms of persecution. And yes, we also have economic migrants. So this then raises a very, I think, uncomfortable question about whether some migrants, some refugees, are perhaps more deserving than others. And it's not a question I wish to answer. I simply want to highlight that as a question we do all need to face. And there probably aren't any simple answers to it. In some ways, I think the response to the crisis has been very interesting, because we've basically had a lot of binary choices that I think are ultimately flawed. We've either had the idea of a completely open door policy where anyone can come in, or a completely closed door policy where everyone has to stay out, with very little differentiation. I think at the end of the day, we need to think about the migration crisis generally in terms of who needs immediate help and support, how best to help people, either in the regions from which they want to flee, or who are already on the way, or those who've already arrived in Europe and now, of course, need support as well. So there are really all sorts of different cases, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all model that we can superimpose. And I think the other thing is also to highlight the importance of actually finding solutions so people don't have to flee their homeland in the first place. The idea that somehow migration is a choice rather than a necessity and perhaps the last resort is, I think, very, very important to bear in mind. Most refugees, even those facing civil war or persecution or extreme economic hardship, don't really want to flee. That's all the evidence that we hear from them. But very often they're not left with any real choice, and fleeing becomes the last resort, becomes a necessity. I think we need to try and find ways in which people can actually stay, if not in their homeland, but then in the region, so that when conditions change, they can actually go back to their homes. Because that's where most people do want to stay. That may not necessarily apply to some economic migrants, but I think it applies to the majority of refugees and those seeking political asylum. So in other words, it's about a balance of interests. On the one hand, we need to help those who face a desperate situation. On the other hand, we also need to take into account the rights and duties of all, including the rights and duties of those who are receiving migrants in their countries. So the challenge before us is how to achieve that balance of interests. One that I think can reflect Europe's foundational values: solidarity with people in need, subsidiarity where decisions are made at the appropriate level, and unity and diversity where no single group, whether indigenous or migrant, feels that their interests are not taken into account. But before I say more about those values, solidarity, subsidiarity, and unity and diversity, let me say something a bit more about the crisis of identity that's facing Europe. So taken together, the migration emergency, the ongoing turmoil in the Eurozone, and the continual crisis in Ukraine, I think pose the most serious danger to Europe since the darkest days of the Cold War. As I've already said, the arrival of millions of refugees has seen a de facto collapse of the Schengen area and the re-emergence of barbed wire fences and strict border controls. Economic devastation in the Eurozone periphery and war in the east, that is in Ukraine, do cast a very long shadow over the European Union and the wider Europe. As I mentioned in the introduction, the post-1945 promise of peace, prosperity and partnership doesn't seem to hold any longer. The 28 EU member states are certainly home to high living standards and the biggest single market with over 550 million consumers. But the 2008 economic crash has actually exposed the sheer precariousness of the much vaunted European social model and also the European ways of life. Yes, the economic miracle after the Second World War was real and conditions got a lot better for most Europeans, but the crash in 2008 shows just how fragile those foundations can be, how quickly people can slide back into poverty and a very precarious life. Without I think, radically different economic settlement going forward, the European Union as a whole faces the paradox of a richer economy with poorer people. So we have growth, and growth has resumed again since the recession after 2008, but that growth isn't benefiting most people. It's actually only benefiting fairly small sections. And amid rising inequality and persistently high youth unemployment, there's a very real prospect for the first time since the Great Depression of 1929-32, that this generation of 18 to 25-year-olds and their children's generation will be worse off than their parents' generation. So the promise that people will be better off, the promise that the middle class will grow, is actually one that no longer holds for vast parts of Europe. So quite a turnaround from the post-1945 era. Moreover, the so-called peace dividend after 1989, after the peaceful end to the Cold War, has also been largely squandered. All divisions between the West and Russia are more entrenched, while new conflicts threaten the whole of Europe, starting with ISIS, who are not only operating in Syria and Iraq, but are also advancing in Libya, and of course are trying to radicalize European-born Muslim men. And that, of course, is a huge threat, as we've seen with the Paris and Brussels attacks last year and earlier this year. Arguably, both NATO and the EU currently lack the strategic vision to deal with these threats and to build a security architecture that can actually pacify the European space and its wider orbit. Crucially, the sense of partnership among nations, peoples and countries has been undermined. EU members are now sharply divided over how to respond to the migration emergency, how to deal with the Eurozone crisis, and how to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and ultimately how to work or not with Russia. Both old allies and new partners view each other as adversaries, perhaps not enemies, but certainly adversaries. And they don't really seem to trust much the European institutions. The Council, the Commission, the Parliament and the Court. They don't trust them to essentially take decisions that are all in their shared interest. Of course, the process of European integration and enlargement will continue in some way. I'm not here to say that the European Union will collapse, and I'm certainly not here to say that all institutions that have been built will just disappear. Of course not. But I think the transformative dynamic of trying to unite the whole of Europe, which was, I think, in place after 1989, has now ground to a halt. So at the heart of this crisis of identity, what is Europe for? What about the promise of peace, prosperity, and partnership? At the heart of that crisis, I would say, lie three closely connected values: solidarity, subsidiarity, and unity and diversity, as I've already mentioned. The argument I want to put forward for discussion here this afternoon is that the EU in its current configuration actually erodes these three values. Not necessarily in a deliberate manner, but I think it does ultimately erode them. Let's start with the principle of solidarity. That principle is essentially about providing mutual assistance to the most needy, be they indigenous people or indeed be they migrants. The principle of subsidiarity, as you know, is all about taking decisions at the appropriate level. It's really about self-government at the most appropriate level in accordance with the dignity of the person and human flourishing. Now, in most cases, that would mean trying to devolve power to lower levels, local government, maybe regional authorities. Of course, in certain respects, it can mean higher levels, where you can only act effectively together at a high level. So climate change, terrorism, financial transactions, maybe their action is actually needed at a supranational level. So why am I saying that the EU does not uphold these two principles, does not really defend these two values? Well, to my mind, the key problem is this. The EU as a structure now views these principles as largely formal procedural devices. Solidarity is now equated with little more than redistribution by central control. So there's nothing very interpersonal, nothing very cooperative about this. Meanwhile, subsidiarity allows both Brussels but also national capitals to shift the burden of blame to devolved levels, to lower levels, without really transferring power to people. So in other words, subsidiarity and solidarity have become hollowed out. They're there in principle, they're in the treaties, everyone talks about them, but their substantive meaning no longer really holds. I think there are two sources for this. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that there was an ambiguity at the heart of the European project from the beginning. And this is to do with the primacy of economics and politics over society. Essentially, the whole of European integration and enlargement is predicated on the idea that if we start with economic cooperation, we will end up with political unity somehow. And this is something which was already enshrined in the 1957 Rome Treaty that gave rise to the European Economic Community, which was later on followed by the European Community and then the European Union. What was enshrined in the Rome Treaty of 1957 is this so-called Jean Monnet method of supranational integration, named after the French technocrat Jean Monnet, who first headed the high authority that later became the European Commission. This method is also known, forgive me the academic jargon, as neo-functionalism. Very basically means that ever more economic exchange and legal uniformity will over time produce political unification. Okay, so you start with the economy and the politics essentially will follow, and of course so will social and cultural unity as well. This is also known as the community method of automatic supranationalism, where the supranational level should act wherever possible. I would argue that this actually privileges more centralized procedure over substantive coalitions of interest. And over time then, this hollows out, as I said, the core meaning of values like solidarity and subsidiarity. The second reason for this state of affairs is the 1985 Single European Act. What the Single European Act did is to create a single market. And of course, this is one of the great achievements always mentioned by everyone. The single market, 550 million consumers, the greatest economic space in the world, etc., etc. Actually, what happened in 85 was that the single market replaced the common market. And this distinction is much more than simply semantic. The common market essentially, in the early days from 1957 until 1985, rested on the mutual recognition of national diversity, just with some basic minimum standards. And this was mostly negotiated by the individual member states. By contrast, the single market since 1985 really promotes top-down harmonization, with all the power now going to the Commission and the Court of Justice. What this has meant in practice is that the EU now has put in place a regulatory regime that imposes uniform standards across all member states, whereas before, the EU directive simply required some minimal harmonization of European law, and then also restricted some unnecessary regulation in individual member states. But that's only one part of the story. The other part relates directly to subsidiarity. In Article 5 of the EU Treaty and in other texts, subsidiarity implies that the Union is obliged to take action wherever it has an advantage in terms of scale or effect. In other words, subsidiarity isn't about devolving powers to lower levels, it's actually about devolving powers to higher levels. And of course, if you think about it, the European Union institutions always have an advantage in terms of scale, because they operate at a higher scale than member states, and also arguably in terms of effect, because you could say that if you act together at the level of 28 countries, you're going to achieve more than if you act individually. So what this has effectively done is to invert the burden of proof. The European Union doesn't really have to prove that it can act more effectively and achieve more in terms of scale, because that's part of the definition. It also raises profound questions over legitimate authority to decide where scale and effect really lie. But crucially, it hollows out the primacy of society over the economy. So basically, society, cultural ties, interpersonal forms of solidarity and decision-making have essentially been marginalized, and what's really been favored are central solutions. And as a result of EU legalism and proceduralism, subsidiarity has now really become an engine of centralization, when in reality it was supposed to be a device for devolving power to people. So in short, what's happened? Instead of a more reciprocal recognition of diverse practices, this method has actually imposed centrally determined standards. It does so, of course, not just for member states, but also for candidate countries. So this is a method that also applies to EU enlargement, it applies to the Eastern Partnership, and applies to neighborhood policy. Basically, what we've had is much more homogenization and less real unity and diversity. And I think this is part, as I will say in a minute, about the crisis of legitimacy that's now facing Europe. Now, that crisis of legitimacy is, I think, most clearly illustrated by the sharp decline in popular support for the European project. Now, here, an important caveat is necessary. A lot of national problems very easily and often get blamed on Europe. So it's true that the EU can be just the bogeyman. If there's an economic crisis, if there is a loss of social cohesion, people might easily blame an institution that can't very easily defend itself. So yes, in that sense, the economic crisis since 2008 has certainly reinforced Euroscepticism in many member states, not just in the UK. But I don't think it's only to do with that. I think the Union does suffer from a crisis of legitimacy, which goes far beyond the well-known but I think poorly understood democratic deficit. Let me start with the democratic deficit. Why don't I think that's a huge problem in the case of the EU? Quite simply, because each system of representative democracy suffers from some deficit. Why? Because elected representatives, no matter where they are, can actually never really fully represent the views of their voters. So whether you are dealing with local government or regional authorities or national politics, there's always going to be a certain democratic deficit, greater or smaller depending on the country and the level of decision making. So democratic deficits are an inherent feature of political representation. We can try and reduce it, but we can never really eliminate it. I think what's far more serious than a democratic deficit is a crisis of legitimacy. And that concerns the lack of public trust and popular assent. Or, if you want, legitimate rule. And legitimate rule is important because it actually transcends just formal arrangements and procedures. Legitimate rule involves at least three core capacities, and I think the EU lacks at least quite a lot in each of these cases. Let me name them. The first capacity is to make a political system intelligible to its members. I don't think the EU is very good at trying to explain how it works to its citizens. And I think national governments, crucially, are not very good at explaining how they work together with the EU institutions. Very often national governments like to blame a lot of problems on the EU, when actually they're a key participant in this. Secondly, legitimate rule also involves the capacity to mobilize civic consent. Again, I don't think the EU institutions in Brussels and Strasbourg, but also EU member states, aren't very good at mobilizing civic consent for what they do. And the third capacity relates to the ability to engage your citizens. Again, I don't think the European Union actually mobilizes its citizens very much at all. Just think about the turnout of European Parliament elections and think, as I said, about just how little people really know about the European Union. They don't know the names of their European members of Parliament. They don't really know how member states and the Commission and other institutions work together. So how has that come about? Well, in addition to what I've already said, I think there is a fundamental problem with the European Union's political setup. What we've seen in effect, even if it was not intended from the beginning, is that national parliaments and the European Parliament unwittingly succeed in discrediting each other. The increased powers of the European Parliament have not been counterbalanced by its enhanced authority. So over the last 30 years, the European Parliament has not only been directly elected since 1979, but it's also now got greater powers of co-decision, greater powers over the budget, greater powers over the Commission, the President and all the Commissioners. And yet it's not clear that that has been counterbalanced, as I said, by its enhanced authority. By contrast, all national parliaments retain authority, but have in some sense less and less power. So this widening discrepancy between power and authority constitutes a very dangerous tension, which I think is gradually eroding the remaining popular support for European integration. As I said, national governments here have to shoulder much of the blame, because they feel under pressure from certain political parties that are Eurosceptic and from the media, and while they take decisions behind closed doors in Brussels or Strasbourg, they don't really defend them in public. And so more and more what we're seeing is a very simple, very fundamental divide between Europe's elites and Europe's citizens. And that, of course, is part of a wider development in politics that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. The tectonic plates of politics really are shifting, and they're shifting away from the old divisions of left versus right towards a new opposition between establishment and anti-establishment forces. Eurosceptic parties are only one part of this. If you think about all the distrust in certain institutions at national or European levels, if you think about corporate scandals that I mentioned, that people distrust banks and other financial institutions, if you think about tax evasion as highlighted by the Panama Papers, there is a widespread sense, including among people who don't vote for far left or far right parties, that the elites are simply not playing by the same rules that they demand of their citizens. If you like, this might have been encapsulated most clearly by the so-called Occupy movement that basically said that we are the 99% and we are facing the 1% who are not accountable and who are simply not interested in popular concerns. Perhaps a bit simple, but it's quite an effective message to try and convey this growing gulf between elites and people. Of course, this has had its own instantiation in Europe, where basically the mainstream parties have increasingly moved to the center. They've become very centrist, very liberal in economic and social policy terms, and that thereby have left open a wider space of the political spectrum that's now filled by the hard left and the hard right, the far left and the far right. And what really has happened is that the EU has become associated with elites that are not accountable and elites that are seemingly not interested in popular concerns. That, I think, is what's really driving anti-European sentiment. And it's very dangerous because the EU, for reasons I've tried to explain, struggles to reconnect with its citizens. I think we're now at the stage where the European Union confronts a double danger. The first danger is that it's deconstructing the nation state and national identity, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not in a deliberate way, but that seems to be the effect, while at the same time, and this is the second danger, failing in the attempt to build the first transnational political community. As you know from what you've read and heard and debated, there is no such thing for the moment as a European demos, as a European people that is fully involved in European politics. And while we might be in a post-national phase of history in Europe, we aren't yet in a fully transnational political community. I think herein lies the reason for more political extremism and for more popular alienation from the European project. Another way of putting this is to say that we are seeing the gradual breakdown of national social imaginaries, national ways of trying to tell a story about who we are, what are the values we believe in, and how we want to be represented by our elites. And the problem is that while social imaginaries at the national level are breaking down in the face of economic struggle and the effects of migration and all sorts of other factors, as I said, at the European level, nothing yet has taken its place. Nothing so far has taken its place. Now, you might say this is a very bleak picture that I've been painting. And in some ways, I've done so partly because I want us to have a debate about whether that is, a picture that resonates with you and that you think captures some of the trends that are facing us. But the other reason is that I wanted to say some of what I said also in light of a very simple point on which I will conclude. And that point is that there's nothing necessary or normative about the state of affairs. Unlike the most, if you like, extreme forms of Marxist or liberal history, there isn't somehow any determinism. There's no inevitability about where we are or about where Europe might be going in future. On the contrary, everything I've tried to highlight is actually highly contingent. Think of the migration crisis that wasn't really happening a year and a half ago. Think about the economic crisis, which could have been avoided had other decisions been taken in the last 15, 20 years. Think about Ukraine. Think about all of the crises confronting Europe. There is nothing inevitable at all about them. On the contrary, it's all highly contingent and usually the outcome of very arbitrary decisions. So in other words, there's no reason why things can't change for the better going forward. On the contrary, I think we're seeing a certain vacuum where a lot of the old answers simply won't do, and new ideas can actually shape things a lot more than perhaps sometimes we think. Far from actually diminishing human agency, whether individual or collective, I think the times we're living in actually favor human agency, favor individual and collective decision. There is, however, one problem, and that's a problem already highlighted in the 1960s by the, I believe he was Swedish, the Swedish academic Manse Olsen, in a very famous book called Collective Action, published, I think, first in 1962, where he made a very simple but very profound point. And that is that usually collective action, which is necessary to resolve a lot of problems facing different societies, is undermined by vested interests. That certain small sectional interests that are very powerful prevent either individuals or communities or countries or collections of countries from acting together. So in other words, the big question in front of us is how can we tackle vested interests so that, for instance, financial scandals aren't repeated? How can we really transform banking and finance in such a way that we won't see another financial crisis hitting us next year or in 5 years or in 10 years? How can we, for instance, stop certain sectional interests from hijacking civil wars like Syria for their own narrow interests, rather than really bringing about a peace settlement that helps primarily the people of Syria, but also other people in the region and then others beyond the region? How can we resolve the conflict in Ukraine so that it's not hijacked by very narrow interests on, I think, all sides? I think that's the greatest challenge ahead of us. Collective action that actually tackles those profound questions of identity, those multiple crises confronting us, in a way that also deals with these sectional interests. Because if you think about it, the anti-establishment forces on the far left and the far right have one thing in common, which is very hard to deny, and that is that they are trying to confront these sectional interests, that they want to do away with some of those elites that are hijacking politics. I don't think that the far left or the far right have any credible answers, but I don't think we can completely dismiss their diagnosis. So, as I said, I think the single biggest question in front of us is how can we tackle sectional interests so that those crises get resolved and Europe can once again live up to its promise of peace, prosperity, and partnership in a way that is faithful to its foundational values of solidarity, subsidiarity, and unity and diversity. Thank you all very much for your interest.